Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that, they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work, and you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 220. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Jason Pierce, who's a business professor, and I met him recently when he was giving a talk on having a vision for your life, and I followed up with him and just thought this kind of a recap of that presentation he gave and digging into it a little bit more as it applies to you, the listeners of this podcast, would be a great idea. So hopefully you enjoyed as much as I did. Let's get right to it. Dr. Jason Pierce, how are you today?
Doing very well, my friend. How are you, David?
Doing fine. Let me just ask you real quick. Do you prefer to be called Dr. Pierce or Jason?
Jason's fine.
Okay.
Also Jay to my friends, but that's phased out since I've been out of Rhode Island for a long time. But up in where I grew up, all the Jasons were automatically Jay, much like David's would be Dave.
A lot of times in my podcast, we get into your testimony, and like you and I have talked about, I'd like to reserve that for a different discussion. Today, I really just want to jump into a topic that you shared with the youth at our church, which is how you and I met, and it was all about having a vision for your life. And I just thought it would be so applicable to our podcast and to our listeners. So let me just start out right away. Just tell us, first of all, what you do, just for a little bit of context, and why you kind of developed this idea enough to where you put together something to share with others.
Oh, sure. So currently, I'm a professor of business management at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and working as a management professor is my second career. I was a network engineer before that, and then I just realized I'd rather do something that was really helping people rather than corporations. Not that there's anything wrong with helping corporations. We need, the things we buy from companies all the time, but that just wasn't where my passion was. And when I was a doctoral student, I could see while I was teaching courses that the students weren't like I did, incidentally, as an undergrad student. We're there just to get a degree so you get a job and get money. And I thought, oh, there's so much more to life than that. I did those things. And then I went to Georgia Tech and I got a degree in computer science and I had a pretty good GPA. And I came out and was making really good money for a 22-year-old. And I quickly got depressed. And in reflecting on that experience, I thought, I think we're doing this wrong. Right. And I would challenge the students and they would push back a lot. And then, over the years, and that was my first time teaching was back in 2006. So 2006, 2007 is around the time I started asking students questions about this. And over the years, how I've had this conversation with them has evolved and gotten more precise or, neater. The version you saw was, the most recent one, which is, I guess now, 16, 17 years in the making.
How would you define a vision?
A vision is, in my understanding, and you'll find that people might define it differently because in the business world, they'll often cite vision statements, mission statements, and purpose statements. Purpose being probably the least commonly used. And if you read and you say elsewhere, and you say, well, Pierce said this was the vision, but this other person is saying the vision is something else, or is inverting it. That's very common. There's a lot of problems with language like that. That's actually part of my research right now. How do we deal with those? It's called semantic confusion. Is that for me, the vision is what we see as a desired state in the world that we don't currently have.
Well, That sounds simple and it's
Yeah.
to the point. As we've talked a little bit about, this isn't something that we often hear in the church, but you talked about all the reasons why it's important. I'm just going to list some of them and then ask you about it. So,
Okay.
you first of all, you said it can prevent you from getting depressed, which I had never thought about that.
Okay.
You talked about it can make you a better spouse and a better parent. So, explain the connection between these vision and these different benefits.
Sure. And then I'll tie it back to what I said about the vision, mission, and purpose statements, is that one of the reasons those terms get mixed up is they are interrelated, and they all have to concern with some sort of understanding of goals and how we go about achieving goals. And so the reason that having a vision is so important to for our mental health is because that our nature as human beings is to be goal seeking. And this is not Jason Pierce's theory. This is well established in psychology and neuroscience. My wife and other colleagues and I enjoy Andrew Huberman's talks that you can find on YouTube. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford. He has a Huberman lab, and one of the talks that I play for my students has to do with the fact that we are biochemically wired to wake up in the morning to be pursuing goals, and that there's two pairings of hormones that if we don't pursue goals or we don't make progress towards goals, the hormones which we consider stress hormones, especially cortisol, will the experience of feeling a push to do something will turn into anxiety or depression or depression. So we're just wired to do that. That's how God's made us.
You talked about now you were talking specifically to students about trying to help them have a vision for maybe a career or what they want to do with your life, but you talked
Right.
about how it's important to reverse our thinking. In other words, the most common way that people think is how can I get a job? In other words, how can I make money so that I can do what I want to do? And you explain what you mean by reversing our thinking on that.
Sure. So also earlier in my career, my first academic job, I stumbled across on the internet a talk by a gentleman named Dr. Alan Watts. Dr. Watts was a philosophy of religion professor back in the middle part of the 20th century, so in the 50s and 60s. He died in 1973, but he would go around giving talks, and his talks were so impactful that recordings of them are now online. You can find them on YouTube. They're going to have millions of views, even though it's not just listening, it's not viewing. There's very, very little video of him around. But it's the hearing him speak about it, I was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm seeing, but I was unable to express as clearly as he did because in this 3 minute segment, and anybody that's listening can easily find this clip if they put Alan Watts, AlanWatts, in a YouTube search and put Alan Watts, what do you desire, or what if money were no object? Some phrase like that, and these clips will come up. There's different versions of them played to with different background music and video, but it's the same thing. And what he had these talks with his students because they didn't know what they wanted to do, and he would challenge them because they would say the things they wanted to do, they couldn't make them money. And he said, well, let's just forget the money. What would you do with money or no object? And then he says, okay, we'll do that because, as he said, um, somebody's interested in everything. So anything you could be interested, there are other people to be interested in. And so if you get really good at whatever it is that interests you, excuse me, then you could find some way to monetize it. And he didn't use the word monetize, but that's essentially what he was getting at. And so So I encourage the students, and they still argue with me. They're like, "Oh, well, we still need money to live," and that's true. And but it's amazing if we take a minute to look at how many people can monetize things that uh, many of us would consider playing. My brother being one, he likes to have fun. He likes to go out and have fun with people. And now he's a stand-up comedian, and he got into that after being a karaoke DJ and just a regular DJ. And his whole business revolves around helping people have a good time and having a good time with them. And he makes a very decent salary doing it.
You made a comment earlier about how we're wired. You also brought up a
Yeah.
question, a very deep philosophical question in the talk that I don't think we really got into at that time, but I'm going to throw it out to you now. Why did God create people?
Oh boy. So this one, yes, and in fact, and I haven't listened to the full version in a while. Alan L. Watts, perhaps without intending to do so, provides a really good insight to that question in the larger talk. So that segment, it's about 3 minutes that I was talking about before, that people will find, if that we can find if we search on YouTube for Alan Watts. What do you desire? What would if money were no object? That's a clip from a talk that's about 51 to 55 minutes, and maybe I can find a link to that one for you. You could put the podcast later. I don't have it handy, but if during that search you see versions that are 51, 55 minutes, he gets into this, and I don't remember exactly what he said, so I'll just have to tell you my take. But I would encourage listeners who really, if they really want to engage that question, to hear what he said about it, because I was like, wow, that's really, really deep what he's getting at. Um, my short version, simplified version, and perhaps somewhat different version than his is that um, God can't love anybody if nobody else exists, right? And he he was God's full of love, and so that love had to be expressed somehow, and it was expressed in creating people. And I think that's why we reproduce the way we do, or why we can reproduce the way we should reproduce, which is through loving relationships, and have that love expressed in the bringing about of new life.
Yeah, it's certainly not a a light question. I'm
So,
just going to throw this out there. There's a video called "The Why of It All" from the Olive Branch Fellowship that tackles this question as well, and some of what he concludes is
yeah,
along the lines of what you're saying. It also has to do with the idea that that God can truly be lonely, and which kind of goes against a little bit of a narrative in Christianity as well. But anyway, that's a
sure.
rabbit trail. But I just want to throw that out there. Yeah, if you can get me that link, I'll put the link for the video I'm referring to in the notes as well. Um, but
Sure.
it kind of elevates this whole discussion, doesn't it? That this isn't just, oh, how can I have more fun in life? It's bigger than that, and it's more important than that. You mentioned earlier some of the maybe arguments or maybe knee jerk reaction you might get from your students, and I'm just kind of sitting here thinking about myself and my listeners who, I don't know the total demographics of my listeners. Some of them very well may be younger people who are planning their future career, but I'm guessing that most of them are, in the middle of their career, towards the end of their career, etc. And so
Mhm.
one reaction might be, well, I've already invested so much in my current situation, my education, my job. If you're proposing, I have what you call the proverbial golden handcuffs. If you're proposing that, and I've got financial obligations, I got to pay for this, I got to pay for that. Are you suggesting I just throw that away or ignore all that and pursue what I love?
Oh, absolutely not. And I want to add just a little tie back to something you brought up that I left out earlier in that bit about the goals, is that they have to be meaningful to us. Or I should say, is the more meaningful the goal, the better the psychological response and experience for us. So if we're making progress to goals, the more meaningful those goals are, because we can pursue any goal. We can play video games. We can try to get likes on online or whatever, but those are very shallow goals, and they don't and very transient, and they don't really translate to the type of um, sense of significance and accomplishment that we really want to have. And we substitute things like that. And Huberman talks about that as well. And I just added this to it. I think my own experience tells me that we'll substitute those things, but it's like substituting potato chips, and pizza for a real healthy, well balanced meal. Right? You can do it, but it's not going to have the same result.
But you talked earlier about reversing our thinking,
Yeah.
because the common thinking is, make money first and then I'll figure it out, kind of a thing.
Right. Right.
And I could relate to some of what you were saying because there was a season of my life where that was my main focus. I wanted to become a real estate millionaire, independently wealthy, and I didn't have the all the whys and the vision figured out in my life, but I just figured if I could get rich enough so I didn't have to do what someone else told me to do every day, I'll figure it out, kind of a thing. And
Right.
you made a
Yeah.
couple points. One of them is that rarely happens, even though there's if you go on the internet and infomercials and all that, you might think otherwise, that it's very possible to become independently wealthy. But the reality of it is that does rarely happen. And then the other point you said is that what would you do if you really have to think about what would you do with your time if you did become independently wealthy, right?
Exactly, exactly. And so to tie this back with the question, I could do I detoured us a bit from your previous question, but I think this all connects. Is yes, I challenge the student to reverse it because those of us when I grew up lower middle class, I put myself through school, and I've known it's like to struggle financially. And so when we're in those survivalist modes, all we can think about is how can we get more money to have a little breathing room, and then we get stuck in that mindset of wanting more money to have more freedom to do what we want. But the problem with that, and then I've lived this as well, is once we get into a place where we really have all the freedom we could handle to do exactly what we want, if we haven't thought about what we really want to do and really thought it through and really tried and explored those things, we will be lost. And I've seen this happen not just in my own life and other people's lives. I met a retired professional pitcher retired from Atlanta Braves on a flight, and he and I talked about that. And he said, "Oh yeah, it's extremely common that professional athletes, once they retire, have a lot of trouble psychologically because they end up being in a very lost state. They don't know what to do with themselves."
I did want to get into the some of the mechanics of this. Like you made the comment that if you don't know what your passion is, that can make us feel like there's something wrong with us, and you kind of were
Oh,
encouraged.
right. So this,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So I'm not. Certainly, there are other professors who think and engage their students like I do. And there was an article I stumbled across in Psychological Science, which is a very highly regarded uh, psychology journal. And the the crux of the article was saying, be careful having these conversations with students because if you just tell them, hey, this is what you need to do, and this is how you have a meaningful and content life, and even that was, I don't know if it was in that article or ones preceding it, but saying, look, the way what we really want for our lives is not happiness, it's satisfaction. And there's a lot more we could talk about that. And if you have time and you want me to get into that a little bit more, what that looks like and why being happy and comfortable and feeling good all the time is actually not good for us. And it's not even really what we want if we understood it. But is when we push the conversation in towards purpose and vision, then what can happen is students who are unclear what their purpose and their passions are will could feel some sort of well, feel bad in some way, to use a very technical term. They'll feel bad because they'll feel like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I don't I how if I don't know my passion, then who else would know? And they could get bogged down in that. And what needs to be added to this conversation, hopefully I did in the talk that I gave, is the importance of exploring and trying things. And this connects back to the pushback arguments that you asked about a few moments ago, because um, students, and I was the same way, my thinking, and this is dysfunctional thinking, are reluctant to explore and experiment because they feel like their time is too limited. And if they get it wrong and they start going down the wrong path, then they've quote unquote wasted their time, which is completely untrue, but that's how they think. And that's how I used to think.
So basically, you're saying embrace the process of exploration, and not think about how maybe the negatives of that, like you're wasting your time, or or the risks involved.
Exactly. I liken it to going to some other world, and it could be another country for some listeners, but at least or for those who are well traveled, and they have to imagine going to another world in which the foods were completely different. Still food, still edible, but completely unrecognizable. And you say and you go there and you visit, and your first meal is a buffet, and there's just all these different things you've never eaten before in front of you. The reality is, among those things, you have favorites and you have things you probably won't like, and you have no way to find out other than try them.
Well, another method you mentioned was just to start asking yourself questions,
Oh,
and
sure. Oh, yeah.
like,
And then
what do you
that could be one way to do it. Yes.
yeah, and I thought it was interesting. You said, "What do you really love?" Which makes
Mhm.
sense, but then you also said, "What do you really hate?" Why is that a good question to ask?
Right. Oh, yeah. The love and well, because love and hate are really two sides of the same coin, right? Because if we really love one thing, then we're likely to hate its opposite. There was a pastor, and I heard that say something to that effect in Indiana, and I thought, oh, that's really true. And he said, and he used that argument to explain why there's a hell and why there's judgment and things that God is adamantly opposed to, because there's things that He is passionately for, primarily loving people. So He is adamantly against things that are unloving, and um, that's of course another philosophical question of how that looks and how it should look. But the reality is, if we can, there's things we love and really enjoy and value, like the sanctity of human life, or freedom to do and say things, then the more we love those things, the more we'll hate the opposite of them, and we can find satisfaction in eliminating those opposites.
Well, you made a comment that so after maybe a process of trying to pursue your vision, let's say you still don't know. And you made a
Sure.
comment that if you still can't figure it out, you might be a simpler person, and that's completely fine. You might take pure joy in making sure the rest of us have the things that we take for granted, and dedicate yourself to providing a certain thing. And when you said that, I thought about several things. One of them was this idea of working for yourself, which in America, that's kind of like the goal. You want to be independent and not have to be under somebody, as opposed to being under someone else's vision and being an employee. And the other thing I thought about was this just idea of contentedness, which I think you alluded to a little bit ago, and maybe another word of is satisfaction. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I'd like to think that's a big part of what we're trying to do with this podcast. Is not is It may be to help men direct them to a place that they're not currently, or it might be for a shift in their thinking about the situation they're already in. In other words, to find a purpose and a vision right where they're at.
Sure, and that's excellent point, and also something I need to bring into these conversations a bit better. And it makes me the way you phrase that reminded me of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And
Yeah, it's like the one thing we can control is how we think about our attitude. Is that kind of one of the quotes from that?
I think that's a good summary of it. And for those who aren't familiar, Viktor Frankl was was interned in a Nazi concentration camp as a Jew, and he was also a psychotherapist. And he lost his wife and his children to that atrocity. And he had been working on this thing that he called logos therapy, and the point of it was to find meaning in whatever situation, circumstance we find in life. And so he ended up living, being his own therapist as he was going through that horrific situation. And what kept him going and got him through it was finding the meaning in all the horror that he was going through. And he survived, and he was released, and he wrote that book, Man's Search for Meaning, in 9 days immediately after being released. And so, yeah, and I think that connects back to the other, which hopefully we don't have to suffer things like that. But it makes a powerful point that we can find meaning in really bad, if we can find meaning in horrific things like that, then we can probably find meaning in simpler things, more mundane things. And that to what you were getting at, that some of us can just find meaning in a regular job, find purpose in that. But for that to have that sense of satisfaction, that purpose has to be clear. It has to be explicit in our minds. Otherwise, how will it help us?
That raises, I think my next question was, in your mind, can we simply choose to be content regardless of our circumstances? Or do you think we need that clarity of vision in order to have true contentedness or satisfaction?
Would you re-ask the question just to make sure I'm answering what I think you're
Let's
asking?
yeah, let's say your goal is to be content. Can I simply make that
Okay.
choice to be content no matter what, no matter what's going on in my life, no matter whether
Oh,
I have a vision, whether I don't have a vision? I'm just going to make a choice to be content. It's a personal choice I'm going to make. Or do you think that the way God made us, there's a step that comes before that?
I think there's a piece that needs to be added. Otherwise, if our only goal is to be content, we can get there simply by choosing to care about nothing. And that's the opposite of what we're going for here. Because there are plenty of people who are complacent and apathetic, but that's also a very unhealthy way to be. And I know that's not what you're just proposing, or what even they would say. Well, no, I don't mean that, but what else would it look? How else would it look like if you don't have a clear purpose? What you're focused on doing. And the reason, incidentally, that the goals work is they focus our attention. We have only so much psychological attention, and that attention needs to be focused somewhere for us to do things and get things accomplished. And the better focus it is, the better we can often do things. That doesn't. I mean, it's also a bigger topic, because there's often many things in our fields, whatever we're operating in, that can interfere with us. And so, I'm not saying laser focused attention is always the best kind, but we have to have intentional focus of our attention, and to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve.
Yeah, and maybe this is like a circular argument. I think part of what I'm getting at is maybe there's an aspect of that we need to choose to be thankful and content where we're at, but we can still have a sense of discontent that drives us towards a goal,
Well,
towards
sure.
something
And
else.
here's another way I would respond to that. But suppose you were a student arguing with me. I say, if any of us are perfectly content with how things are right now, we're we're not paying attention. There's so many things that are going on that are problematic in our world, that if we could just go, "Oh, I'm just content," that's fine. Now we can have a sense of contentedness with what we have in our lot of life, with our lives. That's fine. But if we're only content with what we have, and that stops there, then we're neglecting the the primary law that God's given us is to love other people because we're only thinking about ourselves. And ultimately, that type of self focus is going to lead to the anxiety and depression, which this whole conversation was saying how visions and purposes can save us from.
Well, that's an excellent point. I mean, because yeah, you can very easily become very self-focused when you have this discussion. But
Right.
if you follow God's greatest commandments to love Him, to love others as we love ourselves, you almost it's almost impossible to be totally content if you truly are thinking about others. Because, like you said, there's so many things that aren't right in the world. There's so many needs out there, and so yeah, it kind of, I guess it brings us maybe back to our faith, and that was our, I wanted to kind of finish on that if we could, which was,
Sure.
you know, Jesus talked a lot about the kingdom of God and the way the kingdom works. And I think as Christians, a lot of times we struggle with maybe two extremes. On the one extreme, we want to do what we want to do, and then the other extreme, we think, well, if I just do what God wants me to do, that's going to be not what I want to do.
Oh
what
well,
what's the right way of thinking about it?
well, it's I would say that the right way, the answer to that question is the answer to every question in the courses I teach is it depends because I believe that there are situations in which God tells people that to do things that they may not want to do, like Jonah, being a very, one of perhaps a prototypical case of, hey, go do this. And Jonah's like, no, I'm not doing it. Um, but there's also, this came up a lot when back in the mid 2000s, or early 2000s and mid 2000s, there was a big push in mainstream Christianity to discern or determine God's will for your life. And all these Christians would ask each other, "Have you found God's will for your life yet?" And they'd ask me, and I said, "I think God's will is pretty for our lives is pretty well summed up." And what is it? Is it First Thessalonians 3:16 through 18? Um, I'll have to look up that verse, but it's essentially pray without ceasing in all things. Um, give thanks and rejoice always
Right.
in Christ. And apart from that, I'm really unsure. I would say, yeah, there's probably times where God is telling people to do specific things, and there's other times where He lets us choose our path, much like explained in Proverbs. Where there's at least two passages that get to that point, and Proverbs 3 and Proverbs 16, that as one of the verses says, in his heart a man plans his path, but God directs his steps. And that, and even the Apostle Paul had written about things he intended to do, but was blocked from doing, or he would say blocked by Satan. And then, if the problem with saying that, if we say that we always have to figure out what God wants us to do, is that if you really apply that thinking to what happened to Paul, you say, well, then Satan beat God because Satan was able to block Paul from doing what God wanted him to do, which is clearly not true. Um, so yeah, I think it can be either. I'm not sure it's always clear, and it might be from situation to situation. Right? We're not for That's it. That's a big trap, I believe, that a lot of mainstream Christians fall into, is looking for formulas. Very much like the secular counterparts in the business world. Everybody wants a formula, and life doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a messiness to this, and it has to do with wrestling with what's our part and what is God's part, and yeah, we want a simple answer to that, and I think it's never going to be that simple. We know He's with us. We know He has a plan for us, and if we're seeking His will and in communion with Him daily, I mean, that is a part of this process, whether you hear an audible voice or not.
Right.
um, just by seeking His word and praying, you're involving Him in these big decisions that we're talking about.
Sure. And there's a temptation um, to treat God like we treat other people. Other people care about our behaviors, but God's much more concerned with our attitudes, right? Because we can have the quote right behaviors, but have a terrible attitude, and God hates that. We can fall short in the behaviors, but have a good attitude or humble attitude, and God is very favorable with that. And that's clear in Luke 18, the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. So I think the attitude is what we can definitely control. And apart from that, I'm unsure where the line that you alluded to exists between where our responsibility ends and God's begins. I think it might move.
Well, I feel like we've just started this discussion, but it's been rich, and I've enjoyed it, and it's a good place to maybe lead to other discussions. Very important topic. If anyone wants to maybe reach out to you with questions, how would they go about doing that?
Probably the best way is through my personal email, and also understand I get a lot of emails in that inbox. So if I'm slow to respond, uh, please be patient or try me again. And my work email is public. They could follow up with that. I just want to be careful not letting that box get overloaded because the priority there has to be communicating with my students. But my personal email is based on two Bible verses. So it's the letter J 316 as in 316, and so it's J 316173 at hotmail.com. So it's John, like that's after John 3:16, and then John 17:3, which defines eternal life, and that often gets left out of that conversation. So I'll let the listeners look up that verse on their own.
Very good. Thanks so much for your time, Jason, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Men at Work, I hope you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have. We just heard about Jason Pierce's journey being spirit-led and living out his Christian faith through his work, and specifically we talked about this topic of having a vision for our life. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You'll find links and other information from this show at christianmenatwork.com. Until next time, have a great day and God bless.